November 17, 1943, Tokyo. The Imperial Japanese Navy Intelligence Bureau occupies the third floor of a gray concrete building near the Kasumigaseki district. Outside, frost clings to the window panes. Inside, the air is thick with cigarette smoke and silence. 4 officers sit around a wooden table, staring at a single sheet of paper. The document had arrived 2 days earlier, intercepted from neutral sources in Switzerland, cross-referenced with signals intelligence from the Pacific. The numbers typed across that page are precise, clinical, impossible. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura reads the figure again, his finger trembling slightly as it traces the line. United States aircraft production. January-October 1943, 85,897 units. He looks up. No one speaks. The room holds its breath. Outside, Tokyo moves through another day of rationing and resolve. Inside this room, 4 men sit frozen, confronting a truth that changes everything. 23 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft had struck Pearl Harbor with surgical precision. The attack sank battleships, destroyed aircraft on the ground, and announced Japan's arrival as a Pacific superpower. In the weeks that followed, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia with astonishing speed. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Manila surrendered on January 2, 1942. Singapore, a tadritu for years, Saturday to die, Britain's fortress in the east, capitulated on February 15th. By March, the Dutch East Indies lay under Japanese control, securing the oil resources that had driven Tokyo's strategic calculations. The Empire of the Rising Sun had constructed a defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south, from Burma in the west to Wake Island in the east. For 6 months, Japan rewrote the map of the Pacific. The architects of this expansion understood they were racing against time. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, had warned Japan's leadership with uncomfortable clarity. He had lived in America, studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew American industrial capacity firsthand. In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States, he told Prince Konoye in 1940, "I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." His words carried prophetic weight, but they competed against a tide of nationalist confidence and strategic necessity. Japan's military leadership believed they could secure their defensive perimeter, bleed American resolve through costly island battles, and force a negotiated peace before America's industrial machine reached full mobilization. It was a gamble built on hope, timing, and fundamental miscalculations about American will. The gamble began unraveling at Midway in June 1942. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sank beneath the Pacific in a single day, taking with them hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. The loss was catastrophic, but Japanese leadership maintained strategic optimism. They still held vast territories. They still possessed formidable forces. They could still bleed the Americans in protracted island warfare. Then came Guadalcanal. The battle for that jungle island in the Solomons stretched across 6 months of brutal combat. Japanese soldiers starved in the jungle. Supply convoys were decimated by American aircraft and submarines. The Tokyo Express, Japan's desperate nighttime resupply runs, became floating coffins. By February 9, 1943, when the last Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal, Japan had lost 24,000 men, 38 ships, and 683 aircraft. More importantly, they had lost the initiative. As 1943 unfolded, Japanese military planners began receiving reports that troubled them deeply. American forces were not behaving like an exhausted, overextended power. They were accelerating. New aircraft appeared in growing numbers over Pacific battlefields. Fresh divisions arrived with modern equipment. Naval construction seemed impossibly rapid. Intelligence officers in Tokyo compiled estimates based on pre-war industrial assessments, projected American production based on known factory capacities, and calculated mobilization rates. Their numbers suggested American aircraft production might reach 40,000 or perhaps 50,000 units annually. These figures were alarming but comprehensible. Japan was producing approximately 16,000 aircraft per year by 1943. A 3-to-1 production disadvantage could be managed through superior tactics, defensive positioning, and careful resource allocation. The calculations were difficult but not impossible. The strategy could work if the numbers held. But throughout the summer and fall of 1943, fragments of intelligence suggested something was wrong with the estimates. The Imperial Japanese Navy's intelligence apparatus had once been formidable. Before the war, Japanese naval attachés and commercial representatives had carefully mapped American naval facilities, industrial centers, and military capabilities. They had photographed shipyards, counted factory smokestacks, and assessed port capacities. This intelligence formed the foundation of Japan's pre-war strategic planning. But it suffered from a critical flaw. It was static. Japanese intelligence had accurately measured America's industrial capacity as it existed in 1939 and 1940. But they fundamentally misunderstood America's ability to transform that capacity. They saw factories producing automobiles and refrigerators. They failed to grasp how rapidly those same factories could be retooled for tanks and bombers. They counted existing shipyards but didn't account for entirely. New yards being constructed in months rather than years. Japanese intelligence also suffered from institutional blind spots, rooted in their own experience. Japan's industrial mobilization was constrained by limited raw materials, scarce machine tools, and a relatively small pool of skilled industrial workers. When Japanese planners estimated American production, they unconsciously projected these limitations onto their enemy. They assumed certain bottlenecks were universal, that aircraft production required years of factory preparation, that pilot training took extensive time, that complex weapon systems couldn't be mass-produced without sacrificing quality. These assumptions were reasonable based on Japanese experience. They were catastrophically wrong when applied to American industrial culture. The United States possessed not just larger factories, but a fundamentally different approach to manufacturing. Standardization, interchangeable parts, assembly line production, and a workforce already trained in modern industrial methods. Before the war, Admiral Yamamoto had tried to communicate this reality to Japan's leadership. His time in America had shown him a nation with automobile factories stretching city blocks, steel mills operating around the clock, and a population that seemed to treat industrial production as almost a competitive sport. He saw newsreels of Henry Ford's assembly lines producing thousands of identical vehicles. He watched American football games in stadiums holding 100,000 spectators and imagined that same organizational capacity applied to war. When he returned to Japan, he warned that war with America would awaken an industrial giant whose capacity Japan could not match. But his warnings competed against powerful institutional momentum, nationalist sentiment, and the hard strategic reality that Japan's oil embargo left few alternatives to military expansion. By 1941, the voices counseling caution were overwhelmed by necessity and optimism. By November 1943, Japan's intelligence services were desperately trying to piece together accurate assessments from fragmentary evidence. They monitored American radio broadcasts for production announcements. They debriefed submarine commanders who reported seeing massive convoys of new ships. They interrogated captured American aircrew, asking about factory locations and production schedules. They analyzed wreckage from downed aircraft, noting serial numbers that suggested impossibly high production runs. Agents in neutral countries forwarded industrial reports and newspaper clippings. Slowly, a terrifying picture emerged. American production wasn't following the curves Japanese planners had projected. It was accelerating beyond anything their models predicted. By late 1943, intelligence officers in Tokyo were receiving reports that seemed like intelligence failures or enemy disinformation. Surely American propaganda was inflating their numbers. Surely their agents were being fed false information. Surely no nation could produce aircraft at the rates being reported. Then came the verification. Intelligence officers cross-referenced multiple independent sources. Signals intelligence revealed American units deploying with aircraft serial numbers in ranges that implied massive production. Captured documents from downed American bombers included maintenance logs referencing production batches. Neutral observers in the United States reported directly on factory outputs. The Japanese consulate in Portugal forwarded copies of American newspapers that openly discussed production milestones, articles celebrating the 50,000th aircraft or the 100th Liberty ship, printed without apparent concern for operational security. The Americans weren't even hiding their numbers. They were broadcasting them as propaganda, confident that knowledge of American industrial might would itself serve as a weapon. When Lieutenant Commander Nakamura's team compiled their final report in November 1943, they had verified the figures through 6 independent intelligence streams. The numbers were real. The implications were catastrophic. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima in 1932, 11th in his class. He spoke adequate English, studied mathematics with precision, and approached intelligence work with the methodical care of an engineer solving problems with finite variables. His 3 colleagues in the intelligence section shared similar backgrounds: Naval Academy training, language education, analytical minds shaped by Japanese military culture that valued discipline, hierarchy, and unshakable commitment to duty. They were competent officers executing their responsibilities in a war they believed Japan could win through superior spirit and tactical excellence. The numbers arriving on their desks throughout 1943 challenged not just their strategic assessments, but their fundamental understanding of how wars were won. These men had been trained to analyze enemy fleet movements, decode signals, and estimate tactical capabilities. They were not prepared to process industrial statistics that suggested their nation was fighting an opponent operating at a scale beyond conventional military calculation. The final intelligence summary, dated November 15, 1943, laid out the data with bureaucratic precision. United States aircraft production, January through October 1943, 85,197 nets. The report included breakdowns by category: fighters, bombers, transport aircraft, trainers. It noted specific production achievements. Boeing's Seattle plant, producing B-17 Flying Fortresses at a rate exceeding 16 aircraft daily. Ford's Willow Run facility in Michigan, building B-24 Liberators on an assembly line 1 mile long, with 1 complete bomber emerging every 63 minutes at peak production. Consolidated Aircraft's San Diego plant, Douglas facilities in Long Beach and Santa Monica, North American's factories in Inglewood and Dallas, all running multiple shifts, all producing aircraft in quantities that individually exceeded Japan's entire national output. The report included comparative data. Japan's total aircraft production for 1943 was projected at approximately 16,000 units. The American advantage was not 3-1, as earlier estimates suggested. It was 5-1, nearly 6-1, and the gap was widening. The numbers themselves were devastating, but the underlying industrial capabilities they revealed were perhaps more frightening. American factories weren't just producing more aircraft. They were producing them using methods Japan couldn't replicate. Ford's Willow Run plant employed 42,000 workers operating in coordinated assembly sequences. Parts were standardized across thousands of aircraft, allowing rapid production and field maintenance. The B-24 Liberator, a complex 4-engine heavy bomber weighing 36,000 pounds empty and carrying 10 crew members, was being built using automotive assembly techniques. Workers installed engines, hydraulic systems, and armament packages using standardized procedures that required days rather than weeks. By November 1943, Willow Run was producing one complete B-24 every hour during peak periods. The Japanese intelligence report included technical analysis of captured B-17 and B-24 wreckage. Japanese engineers marveled at the build quality, the standardization, the apparent ease of manufacture. American aircraft used self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating, and redundant systems that added weight but dramatically improved survivability. Japanese aircraft, like the Zero fighter, had been designed for maximum performance at minimum weight, sacrificing protection for agility. The industrial philosophies were fundamentally different. For Japanese military planners, the production numbers carried immediate strategic consequences. The Absolute National Defense Zone, established in September 1943, represented Japan's attempt to create a sustainable defensive perimeter from the Kuriles through the Marianas, Western Caroline Islands, Western New Guinea, and the Indies. The strategy assumed Japan could fortify key positions, inflict heavy casualties on attacking American forces, and maintain air superiority over critical areas through land-based aircraft. But the production numbers revealed this strategy's fatal flaw. Even if Japanese forces achieved favorable exchange ratios, shooting down 2 American aircraft for every Japanese loss, American production could replace those losses in days, while Japan struggled for months. The mathematics were merciless. Air superiority, the foundation of Japan's defensive strategy, was becoming impossible to maintain not through tactical failure, but through industrial reality. Every island garrison, every defensive position, every strategic calculation now had to account for an enemy whose losses were temporary inconveniences while Japan's were permanent wounds. The intelligence summary included a comparative analysis section that read like a death certificate for Japan's war effort. In 1943, the United States would produce approximately 85,000 aircraft against Japan's 16,000. But the comparison went deeper. American pilot training programs were graduating thousands of new aviators monthly, each receiving 200 to 300 hours of flight training before entering combat. Japan's training programs, constrained by fuel shortages and aircraft scarcity, were being reduced to 100 hours or less. American factories were producing not just combat aircraft, but thousands of trainers, ensuring a steady pipeline of competent pilots. Japanese training suffered from pilot instructor shortages. Experienced aviators were desperately needed in combat units, leaving fewer qualified instructors for training programs. The comparison extended beyond aircraft. American shipyards were launching Liberty cargo ships at a rate of 3 per day. Essex-class fleet carriers were being completed in 16 to 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. Japan, by contrast, had completed 6 carriers since Midway. The United States would complete 17 Essex-class carriers during the war. The intelligence report reached Imperial General Headquarters in late November 1943. The response was fractured, reflecting the institutional divisions between the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, between operational commanders and strategic planners, between those willing to face reality and those committed to fighting regardless of mathematics. Some officers questioned the intelligence, suggesting American propaganda inflation or calculation errors. Others accepted the numbers, but argued that Japanese spirit, tactical innovation, and defensive advantages could offset material disparities. A smaller group, including some senior staff officers who had worked with Yamamoto before his death in April 1943, understood the implications with cold clarity. They recognized that Japan was now fighting for negotiating position rather than victory, hoping that inflicting sufficient casualties might convince America to accept a compromise peace rather than total conquest. But even this diminished hope rested on questionable assumptions about American resolve and political unity. The meetings at Imperial. Headquarters through late 1943 and early Dodiwai 1944 reflected a leadership confronting impossible choices. Acceptance of defeat was politically and culturally unthinkable. Surrender would bring occupation, the end of imperial sovereignty, and national humiliation. Continuing the war meant sending soldiers and pilots into battles where they would face overwhelming material disadvantage, where victory was mathematically improbable, where survival itself became the highest achievement. Strategic planning took on a desperate quality. If conventional warfare was unwinnable, perhaps unconventional methods could change the calculation. If American industrial production could replace aircraft losses indefinitely, perhaps attacks on the pilots themselves, suicide attacks that guaranteed enemy casualties, could shift the mathematics. The seeds of the kamikaze strategy, which would fully emerge in 1944, were planted in these meetings where Japanese officers stared at production numbers and searched for any mathematical path forward that didn't end in total defeat. November 19, 1943, Imperial. General Headquarters convened a special intelligence briefing in a conference room overlooking the Imperial Palace grounds. Present were representatives from the Army General Staff, Navy General Staff, and the Cabinet Planning Board. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura stood before a map of the Pacific, flanked by charts displaying production statistics. The formality of the setting couldn't disguise the tension. These briefings normally covered tactical situations, fleet movements, garrison strengths, supply situations. This briefing addressed something more fundamental: whether Japan possessed the physical capacity to continue prosecuting the war as currently conceived. Nakamura began with methodological explanation. The intelligence estimate derived from 6 independent sources, cross-verified through signals analysis, neutral country reporting, captured documents, and photographic reconnaissance. The American production figures were not propaganda. They were conservative estimates, possibly understating actual output. He moved to the primary data. Projected American aircraft production for 1943, 85,000 to 87,000 units. Projected Japanese production for the same period, 16,000 units. The ratio was 5.3 to 1. In 1942, the ratio had been approximately 3 to 1. The gap was not closing. It was widening. American industry was still accelerating. An Army colonel interrupted. What about quality? American aircraft were heavier, less maneuverable than Japanese designs. Perhaps numerical superiority was offset by tactical advantages. Nakamura acknowledged the question. It was true that aircraft like the Zero possessed superior maneuverability, but American designs were evolving rapidly. New fighters like the F-6F Hellcat were specifically designed to counter Japanese tactical advantages through superior firepower, armor protection, and tactical doctrine. More critically, American aircraft were produced with standardization that enabled rapid field repairs and maintenance. Japanese aircraft, often hand-fitted and adjusted during production, required specialized maintenance that became increasingly difficult as spare parts grew scarce. Quantity possessed its own quality when it enabled sustained operations. A Navy captain asked about carrier production. The numbers were similarly stark. Since Midway, Japan had completed 6 fleet carriers. The United States had completed 9 Essex-class fleet carriers by November 1943, with 8 more under construction. American shipyards were operating at a tempo Japanese industry couldn't match. One Essex-class carrier required approximately 18 months from keel laying to commissioning. American yards had multiple carriers under construction simultaneously, with standardized designs enabling efficient production. Japan's carriers were individually designed, each slightly different, each requiring unique construction methods. The industrial philosophies were incompatible, and in total war, the American approach was proving devastatingly effective. The briefing continued for 90 minutes. Nakamura presented data on pilot training, showing that American programs were producing thousands of adequately trained aviators, while Japanese training programs contracted due to fuel shortages and aircraft scarcity. He showed Liberty ship production figures, over 1,500 completed by November 1943, with production rates still accelerating. He displayed comparisons of raw material access, showing American domestic production and global supply networks versus Japan's increasingly vulnerable shipping lanes. Each data point reinforced the central reality. Japan was fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity exceeded anything contemplated in pre-war planning. The room grew quieter as the briefing progressed. Officers who had entered expecting tactical intelligence were confronting strategic impossibility. When Nakamura finished, the questions began in earnest. Could the intelligence be wrong? Had American deception inflated the numbers? The answer was uncomfortable. No. Multiple independent sources confirmed the general magnitude. If anything, the estimates were conservative. American newspapers reported production milestones openly. President Roosevelt had announced production goals. Publicly, 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 120 in 1943. The actual numbers fell, short of Roosevelt's ambitious targets, but still exceeded Japanese production by catastrophic margins. Could strategic bombing of American industrial centers reduce production? Japanese planners had studied this option extensively. The distances were impossible. Japan possessed no bomber capable of reaching American industrial centers and returning. Submarine-launched aircraft couldn't carry sufficient payloads to meaningfully damage factories spanning entire city blocks. The discussion shifted to implications. General Sugiyama, chief of the Army General Staff, asked the operational question: given these production disparities, what strategies remained viable? The answer required careful framing. Direct confrontation, attempting to match American forces in sustained attritional warfare, was no longer feasible. Japan's strategy had to shift toward maximizing American costs while minimizing Japanese resource expenditure. This meant fortifying key defensive positions, avoiding naval surface engagements where American numerical superiority was decisive, and employing submarines and land-based aircraft in hit-and-run tactics that traded minimal Japanese assets for maximum American losses. Even this defensive strategy rested on optimistic assumptions about exchange ratios and American casualty tolerance. Admiral Shimada, Navy Minister, raised the question that hung over the entire briefing. Was victory still possible? The room fell silent. Nakamura, a mid-level intelligence officer, was not positioned to answer such profoundly political questions. But the data spoke regardless of political comfort. Mathematical victory, defeating American military forces through sustained combat, appeared increasingly improbable. Political victory, inflicting sufficient casualties to make continued American prosecution of the war politically untenable, remained theoretically possible but required assumptions about American public opinion that Japanese intelligence couldn't reliably assess. The unspoken third option, negotiated settlement preserving some Japanese territorial gains, required American willingness to negotiate, which intelligence suggested was absent. The rhetoric from Washington spoke of unconditional surrender. The meeting concluded without formal decisions. Imperial General Headquarters meetings rarely produced immediate policy changes. Japanese military decision-making involved extensive consultation, factional negotiation between Army and Navy, and deference to imperial guidance. But the briefing had achieved something profound. It had forced Japanese leadership to confront quantitative reality. The numbers from that November intelligence summary would circulate through staff offices, appear in planning documents, and inform strategic debates over the following months. When Japanese planners developed the Absolute National Defense Zone strategy, they did so knowing that American production could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. When operational commanders planned defensive battles in the Marianas and Philippines, they understood they were fighting delaying actions rather than decisive engagements. The intelligence report from November 1943 mark the moment when Japan's military leadership collectively understood what Admiral Yamamoto had warned years earlier. They were fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity made conventional victory impossible. In the days following the briefing, staff officers began adapting strategic plans to reflect the new reality. The emphasis shifted from offensive operations to defensive economy of force. Resources were redirected toward fortifying key positions rather than dispersing forces across the vast Pacific perimeter. Naval strategy emphasized submarine warfare and land-based aircraft rather than fleet engagements where American carrier superiority was overwhelming. But these adaptations were tactical responses to strategic failure. No amount of tactical skill could bridge an industrial gap of 5-to-1 and widening. The officers implementing these new strategies understood they were designing elegant solutions to insoluble problems, choreographing defensive battles against an enemy who could absorb losses and return stronger, while every Japanese loss was irreplaceable. They continued because surrender was unthinkable, because duty demanded perseverance, and because wars, once begun, possess momentum that transcends rational calculation. The production gap that shocked Japanese intelligence in November 1943 only widened as the war continued. American aircraft production peaked in 1944 at 96,318 units, while Japanese production reached approximately 28,000, a ratio exceeding 3-to-1, even as Japan desperately expanded its industrial capacity. But the raw numbers understated the practical disparity. American aircraft arriving in the Pacific by 1944 were newer designs incorporating combat lessons: F-6F Hellcats with superior firepower, P-38 Lightnings with extended range, B-29 Superfortresses capable of reaching Japan from bases in the Marianas. Japanese aircraft, constrained by raw material shortages and design obsolescence, increasingly struggled against this technological evolution. The Zero, which had dominated Pacific skies in 1942, was outmatched by 1944 American fighters that combined speed, firepower, and armor protection. Japanese efforts to develop next-generation aircraft were hampered by production delays, material shortages, and the constant attrition of testing facilities and factories to American bombing. The pilot training disparity grew even more pronounced. By 1944, American pilot training programs were producing thousands of aviators monthly, each receiving 200 to 300 hours of flight instruction before entering combat. These pilots arrived in combat units with adequate preparation, supported by extensive training in aerial tactics, navigation, and instrument flying. Japanese training programs, by contrast, collapsed under the weight of fuel shortages, aircraft scarcity, and instructor losses. Training hours were reduced to 100, then to 60 or 70 hours by 1945. New pilots arrived at combat units barely capable of basic flight operations, lacking the extensive training that had made pre-war Japanese naval aviators among the world's finest. The institutional knowledge, the combat experience, tactical wisdom, and flying skill of Japan's pre-war pilot cadre was being irretrievably lost. By mid-1944, Japan was sending pilots into combat who stood little chance of survival against experienced American aviators flying superior aircraft. The carrier production comparison revealed similar trends. Between midway in June 1942 and the end of the war in August 1945, Japan completed 10 fleet and light carriers. The United States completed 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and over 100 escort carriers during the same period. Japanese carriers entering service in 1944 faced immediate operational challenges. The trained aircrew necessary to operate carriers effectively no longer existed in sufficient numbers. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, demonstrated the futility of committing carriers without adequate aircrews. Japanese aircraft were shot down in massive numbers by American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. American submarines sank 3 Japanese carriers during the battle. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force, which had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effect in 1941, effectively ceased to exist as a combat arm by mid-1944, not because Japanese shipyards couldn't build carriers, but because Japan could no longer train the pilots to operate them. The submarine comparison offered a particularly stark illustration of industrial disparity. The United States Navy operated 288 submarines in the Pacific during the war, launching aggressive campaigns against Japanese merchant shipping that strangled Japan's economy. American submarines sank 1,178 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5.3 million tons, cutting Japan off from the oil, rubber, and raw materials its war economy required. Japanese submarines, by contrast, were primarily employed in fleet support roles, attacking warships rather than merchant vessels. This tactical choice reflected Japanese naval doctrine, but resulted in strategic failure. American industrial production ensured that sinking warships, while tactically satisfying, didn't significantly impair American operational capacity. New ships replaced losses within months. Japanese merchant ship losses, by contrast, couldn't be replaced. Japanese shipyards lacked the capacity to build merchant vessels at rates approaching American submarine sinking rates. By 1945, Japan's remaining merchant fleet was insufficient to sustain basic civilian food supplies, let alone military operations. The intelligence revelations of November 1943 fundamentally shaped Japanese strategic planning through the final years of the war. Imperial General Headquarters adopted what military historians later termed a decisive battle strategy, attempting to inflict sufficient casualties in single major engagements to break American will to continue the war. This strategy informed the defense of the Marianas in June 1944, the Philippines in October 1944, and Okinawa in 1945. But the strategy rested on flawed assumptions about American casualty tolerance and ignored the mathematical reality that Japanese intelligence had documented. American industrial production ensured that even costly battles were sustainable. The invasion of Saipan cost the United States 3,426 dead and 13,000 wounded, significant casualties that shocked the American public. But American reinforcements and replacements flowed continuously. Japanese losses at Saipan, over 30,000 dead, including numerous civilians who committed suicide rather than surrender, were irreplaceable. The kamikaze strategy, officially adopted in October 1944, represented Japan's most desperate response to the production disparity. If conventional air combat resulted in unsustainable Japanese losses, perhaps suicide attacks, where each sortie guaranteed at least an attempt at damaging an enemy vessel, could change the mathematics. Between October 1944 and August 1945, approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died in attacks that sank 34 American ships and damaged hundreds more. The tactic achieved approximately 19% hit rates and imposed real costs on American forces. But even this desperate innovation couldn't overcome industrial reality. American shipyards replaced losses faster than kamikazes could sink ships. The psychological impact on American sailors was significant, but it didn't translate into strategic effect. The kamikaze campaign, launched with full awareness of its horrific human cost, represented Japanese leadership's acceptance that conventional resistance was mathematically futile. Post-war, interrogations of Japanese military leaders revealed the profound psychological impact of confronting American industrial capacity. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, who commanded the combined fleet in 1944-1945, testified to American interrogators that Japanese leadership had grossly underestimated American production capacity, and that by 1944 they understood the war was unwinnable through military means. General Kawabe Torashiro, Vice Chief of the Army General Staff, acknowledged that Japanese strategic planning after 1943 focused not on victory but on inflicting sufficient casualties to improve negotiating positions. These testimonies, given after Japan's surrender, confirmed what the intelligence reports of November 1943 had revealed. Japan's military leadership continued prosecuting a war they knew was mathematically unwinnable, sustained by duty, cultural imperatives, and the institutional momentum of military organizations that couldn't envision surrender. The industrial disparity also shaped the endgame of the Pacific War. By early 1945, American bombing campaigns systematically destroyed Japanese industrial capacity, reducing aircraft production to a fraction of 1944 levels. The naval blockade enforced by American submarines and surface forces cut Japan off from external resources. Japanese civilian food consumption fell to starvation levels in some urban areas. American planners preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, estimated they would face organized resistance, but from forces that lacked fuel, ammunition, and adequate equipment. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 provided Emperor Hirohito with the justification to intervene and end the war, breaking a deadlock among military leaders divided between those advocating surrender and those demanding continued resistance despite mathematical impossibility. The surrender announcement cited a new and most cruel bomb, allowing the emperor to frame capitulation as response to unprecedented weapons rather than acknowledgement of industrial inadequacy. But the deeper truth, documented in intelligence reports since November 1943, was that Japan had been fighting an industrially unwinnable war for over 18 months before the atomic bombs fell. The casualty totals reflected the cost of continuing a mathematically futile war. Japan lost approximately 2.1 million military personnel and 500,000 to 800,000 civilians during the Pacific War. American casualties totaled approximately 106,000. Military deaths in the Pacific theater. The disproportion reflected not just battlefield outcomes, but the fundamental strategic situation. Japan was defending shrinking territory with dwindling resources against an enemy whose industrial capacity enabled sustained offensive operations regardless of tactical setbacks. The intelligence officers who compiled the production figures in November 1943 had documented this reality with bureaucratic precision. The tragedy was that accurate intelligence, rather than prompting strategic reassessment toward negotiated settlement, instead became data points in planning documents for continued resistance. Knowledge without power to act on. Knowledge is simply burden. The story of Japanese intelligence officers confronting American production. Statistics in November 1943 transcends the specific history of the Pacific War. It represents something universal about modern warfare, the moment when tactical skill, strategic planning, and national determination collide with industrial mathematics and shatter. Wars between industrialized nations are ultimately exercises in applied economics. Production capacity, resource access, and manufacturing efficiency translate directly into military power. The officers staring at those intelligence reports understood they were reading not just production statistics, but verdicts on national survival. The numbers couldn't be negotiated with, inspired away, or overcome through superior spirit. They were mathematical realities that constrained every strategic option. What makes this moment particularly poignant is that Japanese leadership had been warned. Admiral Yamamoto's pre-war assessments, based on his direct experience of American industrial culture, had predicted exactly this outcome. But institutional momentum, strategic necessity, and nationalist confidence had overridden cautionary analysis. The intelligence report of November 1943 represented reality's return, uncomfortable, undeniable, and too late to meaningfully alter course. Wars create their own gravity, pulling nations deeper into commitment even when rational assessment suggests disengagement. Surrender carried political, cultural, and institutional costs that Japanese leadership found unbearable, even when continued resistance meant sending young pilots to die in mathematically futile battles. The lesson for modern strategic thinking is uncomfortable. Accurate intelligence matters little if institutional structures prevent acting on that intelligence. The Japanese officers who compiled the November 1943 report executed their duties with professional competence. They gathered data, verified sources, and presented findings with analytical rigor. But intelligence exists within political and cultural contexts that shape how it's received and whether it's actionable. When surrender is culturally unthinkable, when military institutions define honor through continued resistance regardless of odds, accurate assessment of impossible situations becomes simply another burden for decision-makers to carry while continuing on. Predetermined paths for the young, men who would die in the war's final 20 months. Denterkenvivert, sailors facing kamikaze attacks, Japanese pilots flying one-way missions, soldiers fighting for islands whose strategic value had evaporated. The intelligence reports from November 1943 represented futures already written. The mathematics were settled. The outcomes were determined not by tactics or courage, but by industrial capacity measured in tons of steel, barrels of oil, and aircraft emerging from assembly lines every hour. The officers in that Tokyo Intelligence Bureau in November 1943 held documents that told them the war was industrially unwinnable. They filed their reports and continued their duties, because wars, once begun, develop momentum that transcends individual understanding. And in that gap between knowledge and action, between mathematical certainty and cultural imperative, lay the tragedy of the Pacific War's final years.